It's great to be here. I'm thankful for this opportunity. I don't get invited to a lot of academic conferences, and it's a unique privilege and pleasure to be here, including with our three panelists. Professor Geddix was my First Amendment professor in law school, and for many years I thought that I was something of an originalist when it came to Professor Geddix and his thinking. I liked his original ideas more than I liked his more current ones. but I'm actually quite thrilled with his presentation. I thought it was excellent, and I'm grateful for the other presentations as well. Very insightful. I'll begin by saying that I'm not an academic. I am rather a practicing attorney, and that will become fairly obvious fairly soon. For nearly 2 decades, it has been my privilege to represent the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and many other churches in matters related to religious liberty. And while I do not speak for the LDS Church at this conference, Elder Oaks can do that later on this evening, I would like to offer some of my thoughts on religious liberty and pluralism that have been influenced by my unique perspective. From that perspective, these are challenging times for many religious believers and their institutions, especially those with traditional moral beliefs. To be sure, the United States still provides significant protections for the free exercise of religion, and there have been important Supreme Court victories in the last few years for my understanding of religious freedom. But the cultural basis for that freedom, I believe, is rapidly eroding. America is rapidly becoming more secular. The decline of religious commitment, the rising preeminence of secular worldviews, and the intensity of the culture wars have undermined the consensus that religion is uniquely important and thus deserving of unique protections. Polling confirms that fewer Americans experience religion as a part of their ordinary lives. Regular church attendance is dropping, especially among millennials. You've seen the statistics. Whatever the reasons for this decline in faith, as the culture becomes more secular, it is also becoming less accepting and less accommodating of religious viewpoints and ways of life, at least to the extent that they conflict with prevailing secular norms. Some now argue that it is intellectually incoherent to deem religion special and thus worthy of special legal protections. As all this unfolds, public policy naturally follows, for in the end, culture drives law and policy. And so I worry that the sphere for the free and open exercise of religion is shrinking. A major flashpoint, of course, is the ongoing sexual revolution and the increasing use of laws and other coercive means to force acceptance of secular views of marriage, family, sexuality, and gender that directly conflict with profoundly important religious views and ways of life. And this is occurring not just in public and commercial settings, but also with respect to religious organizations and their affiliated nonprofit organizations such as religious colleges. You can think of Fred's concentric circles. Theories once used to deny tax-exempt status to racist organizations are increasingly being invoked, at least, to question the tax-exempt status of churches with traditional moral beliefs. More broadly, cultural forces seek to characterize those with such beliefs as either ignorant or bigoted. The risk, and I'm not saying this is already a reality, but it is a growing risk, is that believers in religious institutions that adhere to traditional beliefs may eventually become social pariahs. So if you are a lawyer who represents churches and people of faith, especially those with traditional viewpoints on morality, there are storm clouds on the horizon that you simply cannot ignore. This is a conference that is related to Mormon studies, so I think it's pertinent to ask, how does the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints see religious liberty? Again, without claiming to speak officially, the Church's doctrine on religious liberty is relatively straightforward. There's not enough time to fully explicate it, but it begins with the doctrine of agency, which is akin to what other faith traditions might call free will. God has granted to all people the ability and duty to choose right from wrong and to act for themselves, especially in matters of faith. The exercise of agency is considered essential to God's plan for the human family. Religious freedom ensures that people, as individuals, but also as families and faith communities, can exercise their agency in matters of faith. This encompasses not only the right to believe and worship, but also to speak and act based on one's religious beliefs. It includes the right of faith communities and religious institutions to freely govern their religiously significant affairs. It means that law and society should afford sufficient space so that people, families, and faith communities and institutions of faith can live out their deepest beliefs freely and openly without being made outcasts in their own communities. None of which is to say, however, that the LDS Church believes religious freedom is absolute. Limitations on religious conduct are appropriate where necessary to protect life, property, health, and safety, or to prevent infringement upon the fundamental rights of others. And Elder Oaks has spoken about this, for example. And of course, religious freedom cannot always prevail over the right of democratic institutions to establish the basic framework of society. But limitation on religious freedom should truly be necessary, not merely an excuse for abridging religious freedom. It follows that the LDS Church believes religious liberty is a fundamental right and our first freedom. This is not a place for a full philosophical defense of why religious exercise is worthy of special protection, and I wouldn't be the one to provide that defense, but I believe that the case can still be made and made powerfully. One reason I think that is personal, because in addition to being deeply religious, I also hold profoundly important secular beliefs and ideological commitments. I know what it's like to feel passionately about political, social, ethical, and philosophical values. They affect my thinking, my conversations, my personal relationships, my hobbies, and much, much more in my life. But my religious beliefs and my exercise of those beliefs are, for me, whole orders of magnitude different and more profound. My faith speaks to the deepest elements of my soul in ways that my secular beliefs can't. My religion orders and gives meaning and purpose to my life, answering the ultimate questions of life and death and the hereafter. It defines my marriage and family relationships in ways far beyond my secular belief systems, and it constrains my desires and behavior while at the same time empowering me to live, however imperfectly, according to my highest aspirations. It affords me a faith-filled community where fellow believers can congregate, renew our faith, and regain hope, where there are social structures within which free individuals can find themselves and explore the depth of their humanity. And most profoundly, my religion is tied to my very identity and my very own sense of personal dignity. To put it simply, my faith goes all the way down. And the same is true for tens of millions of Americans of many different faiths. A few years ago, Professor Douglas Laycock offered an insightful comparison. He wrote, quote, "One of the ironies of the culture wars is that religious minorities and gays and lesbians make essentially parallel demands on the larger society. I cannot fundamentally change who I am," they each say. "You cannot interfere with those things constitutive of my identity. On the most fundamental things, you must let me live my life according to my own values." Those who claim that sexual orientation, gender identity, or for that matter, physical disabilities, or any other important characteristic, deserve unique status and special protections to guard against material threats based on those characteristics, should readily support special protections to guard against material threats to the free exercise of religion. The issues are in many ways, not perfectly, but in many ways, analogous. Religion is special for many other reasons that I don't have time to touch on, but suffice it to say that in my view, our laws, history, and traditions have properly afforded religious conscience and religious exercise special protections. In this, America is not alone. The Religion Clause of the First Amendment embody one of the deepest principles of liberty for all human beings. Indeed, religious liberty is not only a first freedom, but also the oldest of the internationally recognized human rights. It was afforded international protection at least as early as 1648 in the Peace of Westphalia. Thanks to Professor Durham for that insight years ago. In concluding that freedom of religion is a fundamental human right and a foundational freedom worthy of unique protection, the LDS Church reaffirms a profound truth with a long and respected history. But none of this is to say that the Church teaches that other belief systems and other deep moral commitments are unimportant or are somehow unworthy of great respect and even legal protection. It is only to say that the growing diversity of worldviews is not a reason to retreat from a firm commitment to religious liberty. If anything, the opposite is true. What our current condition calls for is a mutually respectful and insightful dialogue about what true pluralism means in a society that aims to respect human rights and allow people to live and flourish according to their most profound beliefs. It calls for a deeper reflection on and commitment to civil society, that largely unregulated space between the mega institutions of the state, market, and mass culture on the one hand, and the private sphere of the individual and family and the church in its small sense on the other. And it calls for a better understanding of why religious freedom is an indispensable pillar of a larger civil freedom that protects pluralism and the right of all people to live according to their deepest beliefs. You're all familiar with some of the statistics, some of those were referenced earlier about how societies that tend to protect religious freedom also protect a whole series of other rights. It's all interrelated. It is important to remember that healthy pluralism is a social and political ideal that lacks a single legal protection. There's no constitutional right to pluralism generally. Free speech is, of course, important in pluralism, but it cannot secure it alone. Freedom of association is likewise too limited, and government has broad latitude to regulate property and contract rights. Religious freedom, by contrast, is a long-standing, well-recognized structural barrier against an all-powerful state. It stands as a potent bulwark against the states assuming full competence and power over all realms of social life, denying it the authority to impose orthodoxy. Indeed, it denies the legitimacy of such power, not just in some small, intimate zone, like the right of intimate association, but in a major area of life that has profound effects on society and the nation. In other words, religious freedom withholds regulatory authority in an area that the state would often dearly like to regulate for the supposed good of society. In doing so, religious freedom helps maintain greater space, not only for believers, but also for all people and institutions in civil society, religious or not. For if churches, synagogues, and mosques can govern their internal affairs free from state intrusion, shouldn't secular associations, museums, charities, universities, and so forth likewise be afforded substantial space to govern their affairs too? And is not academic freedom, especially for the university itself, really just a secular and somewhat less developed version of what courts have often referred to as the church autonomy doctrine? And conversely, if we weaken religious freedom, that great barricade against total state power, on what basis will the state be limited when it turns its attention to other voluntary institutions? I think as Patrick alluded to it earlier, again, there's a strong correlation between strong religious liberty and a freer society, a society that respects numerous other rights. Religious freedom, properly understood, incubates a love and a respect for the civil freedom of others. The famous Lord Acton wrote of the strong connection between religious liberty and civil liberty. He said, and this is the Lord Acton of Power Corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, of course. He said, the idea that religious liberty is the generating principle of civil liberty, and that civil liberty is the necessary condition of religious liberty, was a discovery reserved for the 17th century. The cause of religion had as much to do as any clear notions of policy in making this country the foremost of the free. So in my view, and I believe this is consistent with the views of the LDS Church, we should be talking not about constricting religious freedom, but rather about how to better accommodate everyone's right to adequate space to live out their deepest moral commitments in dignity and without being ostracized. And I think Professor Geddick's concentric circles are very useful for that project. Trying to identify the zones that are most important for the exercise of religion and those that are most important for society to have a voice in. And try to weight those and to look very carefully and very closely at the human interests that are involved within each of those zones. Finally, I'd like to offer a few suggestions for our current situation. First, in this current moment of rapid change and uncertainty, we need to publicly and quickly agree on protecting and affirming the core of religious freedom. Again, thinking about Professor Geddick's concentric circles. Why? Because we need to calm the fears in religious communities across the nation, and those fears are real. If we think of religious freedom as a number of concentric circles, with what is most vital at the very center, surely we can all agree that certain things near the center should simply be off limits to government. Those whose social and political agendas bring them into conflict with traditional religion should do everything they can to reassure believers and institutions of faith that what is most vital to their survival and dignity is not threatened. So what rights am I referring to? They would include the right not to be punished by the state, including by denying tax-exempt status based on religious beliefs and core practices. The right of faith groups to determine their doctrines, sacraments, and to set criteria for ministers, membership, access to sacred spaces, and employment within religious institutions. And the right to establish religious institutions whose internal ecclesiastical affairs are essentially beyond government's regulatory power. Obviously absent, the Aztec priest trying to sacrifice somebody or other kinds of physical harm. They would include the right to speak openly about religious beliefs, the right of parents to pass on their faith and religious practices to their children, and the right not to be excluded from an occupation based on religion. Key rights would also include the right of believers and faith groups to establish schools and universities and charitable organizations that reflect and uphold their religious beliefs in word and deed. Now that list is not exhaustive. Unfortunately, most of these areas are not yet immediately and materially threatened, but those who care about religious liberty should nevertheless affirm them often, so people of faith and their institutions can be assured that despite ongoing social and legal changes, they will continue to have the core space that they need to live out their most cherished beliefs. Second, we need to promote a culture of accommodation. And this is not just law, but a culture of accommodation. As a normative matter, when reasonable religious accommodations can be made, they should be, even when they entail some inconvenience or annoyance. That's the price of taking religious freedom seriously. Many religion-based conflicts can simply be avoided by an attitude of tolerance for those who just see life differently, even when their views and expressions are offensive. We need fewer hair-trigger lawsuits and social media lynch mobs directed at religious people and institutions with unpopular beliefs and speech, and a little more in this area, just simply live and let live. A culture with such an attitude and practice is one that will also be much more willing to accommodate other forms of cultural diversity. Third, outside those areas of near total religious freedom, where the government should almost never get involved, again, thinking about Fred's concentric circles, in those areas as you get closer to the outside, when religious conflicts arise, we need some common sense balancing. This kind of gets back to what Professor Koppelman was talking about. American courts have shied away from that in recent years, but European and Canadian courts are doing it under their religious freedom documents. It's not always pretty, doesn't always make sense, but American courts can get in the game as well. We need a sensitive, fact-specific constitutional analysis that requires a meaningful justification for governmental burdens on religious exercise. Yes, it will be, as Professor Koppelman mentioned, something of a mess, but I think it's a necessary mess. Because with government continually adjusting the benefits and burdens of economic life and many other areas of life, and regulating all kinds of things throughout society, often in response to little more than just rent-seeking or ideological pique, and with the administrative state constantly issuing reams of new arcane rules and regulations, any meaningful commitment to religious freedom must come with the realization that governmental interests, especially when trivial or symbolic, cannot always prevail over substantial harms to the free exercise of religion. Something far more nuanced and sensitive to religious hardships than a mere rational basis review, which is sort of a current standard, where the government virtually always wins, is needed. For one, such an analysis should inquire into whether there are other reasonable means by which government can pursue its objectives without burdening religious exercise. Adequate alternatives that respect religious freedom and still advance the government's interests should be preferred whenever available. Likewise, not everything that the government labels a harm should be sufficient to abridge religious liberty. Government, of course, exists to protect people from harms to their person and property, liberty, and so on. But if taken too far in a society with so many competing interests, and so much government regulation, and so much redistribution of interests, and so forth, the notion that religious freedom can never result in anything that can be labeled harm, no matter how trivial, would dramatically reduce this fundamental right. I began on a somewhat negative note, but I'd like to end on a positive one. I truly believe that there's ample room in our society for an understanding of religious freedom that protects enough space for people of faith and those with competing visions to live together in freedom and peace. America's actually really good at this. We know how to do it. It's in our DNA to try to figure out how to get along. But it's going to take hard work. It's going to take a lot of goodwill, and it's going to take a commitment by all sides to preserving religious freedom as a fundamental human right, one that is at the core of a just and pluralistic society. I'm grateful that some of that important work is being done by the good people at this conference. I thank you.